I was at the National Concert Hall this summer, having just been asked by Mary-Liz Trant if I'd be willing to give a keynote based on my paper submission to Centre Stage. With our conversation very fresh in my mind, Paul Brady's wonderful song, Nobody Knows, which he played with his band that night, resonated in a very particular manner. I was struck by two things. First, how on that evening in the National Concert Hall, our home of official space of classical music, we had a popular Irish artist, Paul Brady, playing with his band, and it ruptured the privileged space of the concert hall and opened it to other possibilities as they created new, wonderful sounds through the arrangements for band and orchestra. Being in the National Concert Hall forced something new and dynamic to happen. In much the same way that Access students, through their presence and resistive strategies, suggest a resourcefulness and a confidence in negotiating their pathway into and through HE, not as limiting, rather as liberating. And so, like Paul Brady, creating ruptures within our privileged and, despite huge gains, persistently inaccessible and inequitable university space. Second, I was struck in a more playful manner, perhaps, by the particular song, Nobody Knows. I had visions of it being played in the buildings and corridors of some of our policymakers and funding bodies, as they generate performance indicators and mechanisms to evaluate what it is we are or might be doing out there in the world of access, of worlds with children, teenagers, adults, in communities, in universities, in our expanded academy. And it seemed to me that based on the levels of prescription of their reporting demands, they might quite resonate with Nobody Knows. More in the sense that they might be saying, sure, nobody knows what's going on out there. And in this context, we might say that they needed to ask and ask and ask in order to know what it is we are doing, teaching, facilitating, and what our students are doing, learning, participating, not doing. Of course, we know very well what it is we do across the breadth of the activities we engage in, as evidenced by the richness and scope of the papers scheduled for this afternoon. We know precisely because we do. And here I am moving into the language of performance as I draw inspiration from the work of scholars like Judith Butler, whose ideas on performance, in her case performativities of gender, are most helpful. She writes of how we perform, or how we do gender. Our performances are our doings. And I want to take this idea of doing and ask very particular questions of how it is we do, how it is we perform education across the myriad contexts and learning environments spanning primary, secondary, third, further, and community levels and contexts. I want to place educational performance centre stage. That's the first thing I want to do. Second, I want to very briefly locate typical approaches to the measurement of such performance. It is important to state at this point that this is not a debate happening in isolation here in this room. Indeed, this presentation reflects many documents currently in the public domain, including within HE, for example, the Landscape document, the HEA Compact, the Royal Irish Academy commissioned report into the arts and humanities, and the appropriateness of KPIs. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, I wish to locate our performances within the prevailing culture of managerialism, and specifically the limiting discourse of measurables, outputs, outcomes, benchmarks, the ubiquitous KPI. The third and final thing I want to do is to encourage a seeing beyond these limiting, rather crude constructions and measures of performance. To do this, I invite our politicians, institutional leaders and policymakers to think otherwise. And here I'm influenced by the work of Paulo Freire, Maxine Greene, Bell Hooks. In short, I wish to recall a pedagogy of hope that acknowledges the importance of risk while embracing the imagination. So the first question is, how might we place access education performance centre stage? Now, I'm going to suggest that there are 5 broad characteristics of educational performance, or 5 Ps. And we know them because we juggle them. These are people, place, purpose, process, and product. We juggle them daily in our teaching, curriculum design, our collaborations, and our partnerships. There may be many, many others, but these are the ones that have emerged for me throughout a career spanning 2 decades. First at primary level and then in youth reach, and for the past 12 years in higher education. And I also draw on the evaluation model developed in partnership with students and community partners involved in the UCD Women's Studies Higher Education Outreach Programme. I'm going to limit my observations to 1 point in each. So the first P, of course, it's people. The performance of access clearly involves a multiplicity of players or actors, those we engage with. Our allies, our students, our community and other educational partners, our stakeholders, our colleagues, often across institutions, across sectors. And those disbelievers who mention things like dumbing down, lowering the bar, overly human resource intensive, the language of counterfactuals, deadweight, attribution. To concentrate on one group of actors are students. Access in student terms is clearly about diversity. Our students, other than those historically deemed suitable for third level, diversify the student population. That is, or certainly should be, how it is. About encouraging people in by breaking down walls, all those who want to be in. However, let us return to Paul Brady. We might well see him on that occasion as the outsider within. Yeah, a well-rehearsed concept, but one that I am constantly conscious of within institutional terms, where access is there, sometimes celebrated, often tolerated. And our students are people very much seen as outsider within, where, as Kathleen Lynch suggests, they come, they're not fully expected, and very often they're not fully accommodated. It seems to me that in order to reflect the very clear ethic of diversity underpinning our access worlds, we need a shift in institutional terms. And here Patricia Collins' work is really, really helpful. She says, rather than equating excellence with elitism, the posture that encourages keeping people out, we might define excellence as being compatible with diversity. And this diversity is so important because it also speaks to what it is we come to know, or not know, as the case might be. To look to Patricia Hill Collins again, she argues strongly that certain questions don't get answered or even asked because of who is raising them and where they are located. And this leads me to the second performance characteristic, that of place. The lived reality of access education in Ireland is quite obviously that it's drenched in questions of place, or more appropriately placelessness, or the places of elsewhere. Whilst the field of education has been traditionally approached as a project in which the spatial is entirely absent, there's an increasing body of work that suggests that place actually matters for how we teach, who we teach, and why. Doreen Massey wonderfully says space cannot be definitively purified. I love that idea that, our education spaces are not pure. She suggests that space can never be closed. There will always be loose ends, always relations with the beyond, always potential elements of chance. And I ask you to recall this when we come to consider how our performances are measured. Our access education stages often develop in the most unexpected places, and these places matter. Over the years, we in UCD have co-created community partnerships in all sorts of places. The Resource Centre in Ballymun, then located in one of the tower blocks up 3 flights of stairs in one of the reallocated council flats. The Loretto Centre in Crumlin, where a feminist sister literally welcomes us in week after week after week to critically question, breed. The kitchen in the house in Clondalkin, Dublin 22, Rodenstown CDP, which all the community know as their classroom. The Action Project housed in a reclaimed cinema in Ringsend, as the Minister said, a sought-after Dublin 4 postal code with pockets of profound and hidden poverty and disadvantage. These places matter because they meant that education became possible in those places. These education interventions needed to be elsewhere other than in the university in order for access to become a reality. Now, our educational performances in these places speak to what can be called situated pedagogies. This is not just limited to our outreach classrooms. This is about all of our access spaces, because a situated pedagogy attends to place, and it means that learning does not stay within the classroom because we don't live in the classroom. Education moves beyond the learning environments into communities as students participate in mapping their material and curricular landscape. And as such, situated pedagogies raise questions as to purpose. We've had this morning. What are our performances for? And so to the third characteristic. And there's no easy answer to this, because if we attend to people and place, then its purpose can be individual, societal, political, often competing. What we do, our performance, has multiple goals, multiple purposes, which speak directly to the who and where of their articulations. However, access is contextualised within the broader Irish higher education landscape, where the knowledge economy reigns supreme and where a key role of purpose of education is in driving economic and social development. And this purpose is restated in a HEA report to the Minister for Education and Skills in April of this year. However, interestingly, in the same document, it also acknowledges that this central role stands as a complement to the historic and cultural roles of HEIs as repositories of cultural and intellectual wealth, and it's places where, and I stress this, the pursuit of knowledge is its own reward, and where the emphasis is on the holistic development of the individual. Now, this restatement of the purpose of education is most welcome. And to it, this more rounded context, I also add the potential transformative purpose of education, and a broad observation of which might be reflected in Paulo Freire's statement that education as a political and ideological activity involves taking risks, where part of the responsibility of our presence in the world is to transform the world. Now, if we take this seriously, the ask is enormous, because the obvious next question, the next one of our 5 P's of performance, is how we're going to do this. And so the fourth characteristic, how do we work on increasingly complex ideas in and across a multiplicity of contexts? Social, cultural, political, economic, ideological. Because all of these are in our classrooms. And here critical pedagogy is really useful. Obviously, we're all delivering content. We all develop curriculum, we develop resources. We also practice a skill set. Take, for example, the translation of ideas and concepts into the language of the everyday. The application of conceptual understanding through analysis, synthesis, evaluation, we all know this. But the third element here is really important, and it's often invisibilized within our process, and that is emotions, or the affective domain. How our teachers and students feel shapes much of how and what we learn, and this has real implications for what we do. Now again, I ask you to recall this when we're looking at how performance is measured. If we acknowledge this affective domain, well then we need to ensure that there are sufficient, appropriate pastoral care, support, mentoring, one-to-one learning supports, all of which are crucial elements to the process, but heavily impact on the product of our educational performance. The fifth and final characteristic. Now, whilst there are multiple products and outcomes at various stages in the performance of education, we are more familiar with an emphasis on endpoint, crude, limiting markers. How many students in category XYZ? How many started? How many finished? At the end of this module, the student will. We, on the other hand, in addition to knowing that these crude measures matter, of course they do, we also know other products, less tangible, more fluid, reflective of various temporalities, where learning moments happen often after and outside the formal learning environment. Things like changes in perception, students' increased agency, increased questioning capacity and confidence, increased knowledges, personal and interpersonal skills. Now, these might well be evident for our adults, for example, in conversations with teachers, with their own children, in hospitals as they advocate for family members, the job interview they wouldn't have considered. But again, nobody knows. We are not there to see or measure, thankfully. Does this mean they don't matter? And thus the tension that accompanies each of us in our daily work. How are our performances, this 5-dimensional, at least, measure, way of capturing the breadth of these performances? Now, unfortunately, little boxes come to mind, and we're all too familiar with the maxim, what gets measured gets done. But there's a real danger that over time our educational practices, our performances, will shrink to fit the boxes imposed on us, as opposed to the boxes expanding and dismantling to reflect and acknowledge the practice, the people, the process, the places, the products, the purpose. So the second task for this morning is to locate these in a culture of measurement, in an explicable context. And I'm going to mention 2. The first is managerialism. Now, we could look to somebody like Kathleen Lynch's work on climate or culture, the reality of managerialism within our institutions. We could look to William Pienaar, who's similarly highly critical, and he calls our educational environments knowledge factories, where, like Lynch, he observes that an overarching corporate metaphor has invaded all aspects of society, including academia. Now, let me be clear. I am not saying that we do away with the narrative of KPIs or increasingly SROIs that seem to have embedded themselves in our educational worlds. Clearly, there is a place for such targets and outcomes. There has to be. Within higher education alone, Ireland has 39 institutions receiving public funding to the tune of 1.5 billion annually, with some 200,000 students. It is in this context that our access programmes, interventions, measures, struggles and students exist. However, what is problematic is that this concentration on corporate measurement has taken on an everywhereness and a singularity to the extent that we are drenched in its language and in its implications. Recall the emotions of pedagogy, of critical pedagogy, the affective domain, or the suggestion that all our learning places always contain loose ends and potential elements of chance. This is the territory of the uncertain, the fluid, the unknown, the emerging, the organic, all of the wonderful places for learning to happen. A second context in which our performances must be located is our national and global reality. We are living, teaching, being within a challenging time. And here Christopher Lasch is really useful, in particular his idea of what he calls presentistic. And here he refers to how we've become so self-involved in surviving the present, survival, that we seem to have forgotten the past or are unable to imagine the future. Now, given the material reality of the past years, Lasch's ideas resonate within the Irish context and the sense of exhaustion experienced in simply trying to survive on a daily basis. Survival within a landscape of, for example, community education, which has seen unparalleled levels of decimation and annihilation. Survival becomes a daily objective. Are we measuring this? Are we measuring the impact of this daily reality on those people in those places? So within this context, how might we inspire our policymakers and those in positions of power to consider another language of measurement? I want to suggest today that we consider a language of performance as otherwise, one that invokes hope, risk, imagination, language that lots of people are uncomfortable with, so as to fully capture the breadth of our performances. Now, Ray Land calls us to rattle the cage of linear, outcomes-based approaches to curriculum design. And I really like this, because it's a clear statement that we need to challenge what already exists. And yes, part of the task is to challenge the current landscape of measurement. However, it also requires, to my mind, new imaginings. So I see Ray Land's call as part of a larger imperative to see and think otherwise. The question is, how? Now, I believe we need help and inspiration, and as a Beckett fan, I suggest that we can draw much from his language of uncertainty. I love this piece. Beckett was once asked, who or what does Godot mean? And Beckett replied, if I knew, I would have said so in the play. The key word in my plays is perhaps. The language of perhaps brings us to the land of conditionality. We might be able to, we will try to, we may end up finding out, finding nothing, but we will have had the learning experience generated from people in place, engaged in purposeful processes. That is our job. That is what we do. We might need more help. And here we could look to Maxine Greene and her wide awake eyes. And she says, imagination, after all, allows people to think of things as if they could be otherwise. It is the capacity that allows a looking through the windows of the actual towards alternative realities. Now again, this is really helpful because it's really doable. She's not asking us to enter some stratospheric arena, some land of sci-fi where suspended reality is a necessary component. No, she's asking us to see the everyday, our everyday, through different eyes. More help? We might look closer to home to the wonderful artist Alice Marr. We might challenge traditional views as what products are by engaging with her provocative art pieces. Alice Marr, whose work ruptures what it means to be art. How might you consider assessing an object which is actually disintegrating before our very eyes, like Cell, defying centuries of privileged high art? Whoever we seek to inspire us to think otherwise, I'd like to suggest that we do so as part of invoking a pedagogy of hope. The hopefulness of performance, our performance, reclaimed, reimagined, replaced centre stage, our performance in all its complexity and diversity. Jose Munoz describes hope as a backward glance that enacts a future vision. For him, it's not about announcing how things ought be, but instead of imagining what things could be. So, like Alice Marr's red-berry dress and the sense of unexpected outcomes when we see beyond the dress to the thorns that lie beneath, or her house of thorns, which disrupt our notions of the everyday. the be careful what you think of moment. In all of these, I am invoking hope, even though Munoz tells us that hope is a risk. But he also says that if the point is to change the world, we must risk hope. And perhaps we need to take a risk ourselves as we resist policy and practice measures and saturation. Perhaps we need to start rethinking how we might re-enter that field and play that game on our terms. Perhaps we too need to risk hope in the 5 dimensions of our educational performance, their contingencies, their temporalities, their challenges, their box-defying complexities. Nobody knows what might happen if we take that risk. Thank you.